Welcome to The Explainer. I'm really thrilled you're joining us today. If you're the kind of person who loves looking past the surface level noise to truly understand the roots of our world, well, you are in the exact right place. Today, we're going to unravel a topic that is as fascinating as it is historically complex. We're looking at the true origins of Kievan Rus and Russia. We are going to step away from the modern headlines and dig deep into the original texts, the geography, and the archaeology to figure out where this massive world-shaping culture actually came from. Okay, let's just dive right in. So, who actually created Russia, right? It sounds like a super straightforward historical question. But believe it or not, the answer to this has been fiercely debated, rewritten, and politically weaponized for over 300 years. To find the real answer, we've got to travel back in time to our single oldest written source on these events. And honestly, it's a text that reads a lot less like a modern history book and a whole lot more like a fairy tale. There's this famous quote from something called the Primary Chronicle that perfectly illustrates this. It says, "Our land is vast and abundant, but there is no order in it. Come and reign as princes and have authority over us." According to this text, back in the year 862, the warring, chaotic Slavic tribes of northwest Russia were so desperate for order that they literally invited a branch of the Vikings known as the Rus to cross the sea and rule over them. Supposedly, 3 Viking brothers arrived in longboats, laid down the law, and eventually birthed the first Russian state in Kiev. Section 1. The Myth of Origins. Okay, so here's the context behind that famous chronicle, because it's actually fascinating. It was put together by a monk named Nestor, along with a few others, in Kiev during the 1110s. Now, that is hundreds of years after the events it supposedly describes. Modern historians pretty much universally agree that this chronicle is a classic foundation myth. It's this wild patchwork of orally transmitted epic songs, Norse sagas, and local folklore. It was specifically composed to establish the political legitimacy of the Kievan ruling dynasty, basically claiming they were God's chosen agents. The monks even traced the lineage of the Rus all the way back to Noah in the book of Genesis. I mean, it was a biblical scale story meant to prove that Kievan Rus was part of this grand divine plan. Section 2. Who built Russia, the political battlefield? Because the Primary Chronicle is so steeped in myth, figuring out the historical reality turned into this massive detective story, in one that quickly became a highly charged political battlefield. It's often called the Normanist controversy. Essentially, it asks, was Russia created by foreigners or by Russians? On one side, we have the Norman theory. In the 18th century, a German academic named Gerhard Friedrich Müller presented research suggesting the Rus were Scandinavians. And wow, did that ruffle some feathers. On the flip side, we have the anti-Normanist pushback, spearheaded by the Russian polymath Mikhail Lomonosov. He fiercely insisted the Rus were indigenous Baltic Slavs and accused Müller of trying to insult the Russian Empire. Lomonosov literally helped raid the academy to confiscate and ban Müller's lecture. And this historiographical debate, it never really ended. It just evolved to fit the needs of whoever happened to be in power. Catherine the Great, who was German-born, actually liked the Norman theory because it tied Russia to European roots. By 1802, historians were using the Norman theory to justify autocracy, arguing that Slavs just couldn't govern themselves without strong foreign-style leadership. But then, jump to the post-1945 Stalin era, and the narrative flips entirely. Driven by Soviet ideology and the Cold War, claiming Russia owed its origins to Germanic Vikings became strictly forbidden. Massive state funds were poured into proving a purely Slavic origin. And today, in the post-Soviet era, we impartially observe modern leaders invoking these exact same ancient stories of a unified origin to assert spheres of influence and modern political inheritance. Section 3. A Eurasian melting pot. So, what happens when we strip away all the political arguments and just look at the actual ground these people walked on? Well, think about the number 11. 11 time zones. That's how far this vast territorial continuum stretches. You really have to understand that Russia grew on a single, massive, horizontal plain between Europe and Asia. There are no oceans or uncrossable mountain ranges to define its borders or keep people out. The Urals are just easily passable hills in a lot of spots. Geography is destiny, right? And this open, boundless geography meant constant, inevitable movement and interaction among diverse groups of people. Now, this massive landmass is naturally divided into 4 parallel ecological bands. At the top, you've got the freezing Arctic tundra. Below that, the dense river-filled taiga forest. Then comes the rich central agricultural zone. And finally, the semi-arid Pontic steppe down in the south. The early Slavic settlers were pushed into those harsh northern forests, and to survive there, they couldn't just act as isolated individuals. They had to practice collective slash-and-burn agriculture. This brutal environment forged a really durable, adaptive peasant culture based on strict collectivism and sheer endurance, traits that would end up defining the region for centuries. And right into this forest of Slavic farmers came the Vikings. But here is the fascinating twist. They didn't come to conquer or loot. Russia was honestly too poor for the kind of raids they were doing over in England. Instead, they came to use the rivers for long-distance trade between Europe and Asia. In fact, the word Rus likely comes from the Old Norse word roa, which means to row. So the early Rus weren't some unified ethnic bloodline. They were much more like a diverse business enterprise of boatmen, navigating all the way from the Baltic down to the markets of the Arab Caliphate. We actually have a first-hand primary source description of them from the year 921. An Arab traveler named Ibn Fadlan met these Rus merchants along the Volga River, and he was just absolutely struck by them. He described them as being as tall as date palms, blonde, and armed at all times with an axe, a sword, and a knife. He even noted that the women wore heavy iron, silver, or gold boxes on their chests just to display their husband's wealth, and they prized green glass beads above pretty much everything else. It is such a vivid, stunning glimpse into the past, it just brings these river traders right to life for us. So the absolutely crucial takeaway here is that early Rus was a melting pot. The Vikings quickly assimilated, adopting local Slavic languages and customs, and they interacted peacefully and profitably with the Khazars, which was this multi-confessional Turkic trading empire to the south. So instead of those nationalistic myths about some pure, epic racial struggle, the reality was a deeply interconnected, multi-ethnic trading union. You had Slavs, Finns, Vikings, and Khazars all cooperating across the Eurasian plain. Section 4. The Byzantine Cultural Shift. So, how did this loose river trading union become a formal, recognized state? Well, it required a massive cultural pivot, and the rise of Kiev was highly strategic. First, as the Khazar Empire began to decline, the increasingly powerful Rus military just stopped paying them taxes. Then, in 882, they captured Kiev, an old Khazar stronghold right on the Dnieper River. This was a total masterstroke because it shifted their entire economic focus. Instead of trading east with the Muslim world via the Volga, they started pushing south down the Dnieper, heading straight toward the richest superpower of the day, the Byzantine Empire. They literally used their military might to extract incredibly lucrative trade concessions from Constantinople. But to truly elevate their state, they needed a unifying ideology. And this brings us to the legendary story of Grand Prince Vladimir in 988. The Chronicle tells us that Vladimir essentially went shopping for a new religion. Supposedly, he rejected Islam because they banned alcohol, famously saying drinking is the joy of the Rus. He wasn't too impressed by papal emissaries or Jewish rabbis either. But when his envoys saw the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, they reported back that God dwells there among men. They were just overwhelmed by its sheer beauty. Now, while that makes for an incredible story, the historical reality is that adopting Eastern Orthodox Christianity was a brilliant piece of statecraft. It gave Vladimir a single, unifying religion in a readily available Slavic language. It brought his diverse territory under one divine authority, and officially linked Kiev to the immense prestige of Byzantium. But here's the thing. That Byzantine religion mutated significantly once it hit Russian soil. Just look at the data here. Of the 800 Russian saints canonized up to the 18th century, over 100 of them were royalty. That's 12.5%. No other country in the world made so many saints out of its political rulers. Beginning with Vladimir's sons, Boris and Gleb, who died in a dynastic war, the church venerated rulers who supposedly sacrificed themselves for the holy Russian land. This created a totally unique sacralization of power. It merged the idea of the state, the land, and divine holiness into one unbreakable concept. Down at the peasant level, though, the picture was a bit different. Christianity was incredibly slow to spread through those vast forests. What developed instead was something called devoaveri, which translates to dual belief. The peasants didn't just abandon their old pagan nature gods. They just kind of merged them with the new Christian saints. The pagan god of thunder, Perun, morphed into Saint Elias. The goddess of the earth was worshipped by placing a sheaf of rye right behind a Christian icon. It became this uniquely Russian peasant religion where the divine wasn't just up in heaven, but was immanent in the earth, in the crops, and in daily worldly existence. Section 5. The True Legacy of Kievan Rus. All of this brings us to the core resolution of our explainer today. What is the true, lasting legacy of Kievan Rus, and how does it actually connect to our modern world? Modern political claims often draw a direct, unbroken line from ancient Kievan Rus straight to modern Moscow. But the source text makes it super clear that this relies heavily on later imperial myth-making. Politically speaking, Kievan Rus was a loose, decentralized, almost democratic-leaning federation of city-states. It actually fell victim to its own massive economic success as regional centers grew too independent. And crucially, there were 250 years of devastating Mongol occupation that fundamentally severed the political continuity between the fall of Kievan Rus and the much later entirely distinct rise of Muscovy. So, if the political line is broken, what actually survived? The real heritage of Kievan Rus is cultural and spiritual. Kievan Rus is not the direct political parent of modern Russia. It's much more like its cultural grandparent. Its true legacy is the Eastern Orthodox religion, the establishment of the Church Slavonic literary language, and the breathtaking adoption of Byzantine art, icons, and architecture. That is the indelible mark it left on history. Which leaves us with this final, vital question to ponder. If nations are built on stories, what happens when we mistake an ancient cultural myth for a modern political map? As we've seen today, the origins of Russia are deeply complex. They're rooted in a vast, diverse melting pot of traders, farmers, and shifting empires. Recognizing the difference between objective history and nationalistic myth-making is absolutely essential to truly understanding our world today. Thank you so much for joining me on The Explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I will see you next time.